We continue now at the top of Daf Mem Tesam and Beis Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 49b. On the previous summit, the Gemara asked, how do we know that the Karban Asham is slaughtered in the north of the Azara? And the Gemara brought a pasuk which compares the Karban Asham to the Karban Ola, that it's slaughtered in the same place. But then the Gemara asked, how do we know that that's a requirement? We usually need the pasuk to repeat something in order to say that it's a requirement, that otherwise there's a disqualification. And the Gemara brought a pasuk by Asham Mitzora. By Asham Mitzora also, it compares the Karban Asham to the Karban Chatas and to the Karban Ola, saying that they're slaughtered in the same place. And that repetition teaches us that this is a requirement that it be slaughtered in the north of the Azara. But the Gemara then asked on the previous Amud that the reason why it needs to be stated by Asham Mitzora really is for a different reason. Since Asham Mitzora has certain unique halachas, therefore we might not know that this halacha of slaughtering in the north applies to Asham Mitzora as well. And isn't that the reason why it's repeated by Asham Mitzora? And the Gemara said if that were the case, we could have just written this halacha by Asham Mitzora and then learned from Asham Mitzora to the general Karban Asham. And so therefore that's why the fact that it's stated in both places shows that it is in fact a requirement. But the Gemara now continues and says that only works if you say that avol klalo gamar minei, that you can learn the klal, the general rule, from that specific unique case. In other words, if you hold that the Asham Mitzora, that's unique and it needs to be stated by Asham Mitzora, maybe you would think Asham Mitzora is different. But once we learn it by Asham Mitzora, we can then learn from Asham Mitzora to regular Karban Asham. This all works. Then Shapir, everything works out fine. Ela isviralan, but if we hold to lohu gamar miklala, that when you have something with unique halachas, it cannot be learned from the general case. Velo klalo gamar minei, and the general case cannot be learned from it either. So then again, hay legufe itzrich. So then don't you need it legufe? You need it for the halacha by Asham Mitzora. It's not available to teach us that this is an absolute requirement. And we're back to our question about how do we know that by an Asham there's an absolute requirement that it be slaughtered in the north. And the Gemara answers to that, Kevan di ahadre, once we return it to the regular halacha of Karban Asham, so then it is totally returned. And Rashi explains the answer of the Gemara, Kevan di ahadre, once it is returned, meaning once the Asham Mitzora is considered like a regular Asham, Uchsiv ki kachatos ha'asham hu kedin chatos kach din Asham, it says like the chatos is the Asham, it follows the same halacha. So ahadre lechlalo, it is now returned to the general category of an Asham, bein lamatan damim, whether we're talking about the application of the blood, bein l'shchitas safon, whether we're talking about slaughtering in the north, v'lo hayatzarech lichto bo shchitas safon, and therefore it was not necessary to write Shchitas Safon over there, Elali Kuven. The only reason it's written is to say that it is absolutely required. But the Gemara still continues and asks, Amar le Mar Zutra Breder Rav Mari le Ravina, Mar Zutra, the son of Rav Mari, he said to Ravina, Ema, why don't we say, Ki ahadre kra legave matan damim ve'imurin, deboy kahuna, maybe the Torah is only returning the Asham Mitzora to the general rule of Asham with regards to the application of the blood and the burning of the sacrificial portions on the Mizbeach, because those things required to be done by a Kohen. Avol Shchita, but maybe when it comes to slaughtering, the lo boy kahuna, which does not require a Kohen, lo mi boy tzafon, so maybe the north is not required, who says, and so therefore maybe we really do need to have the pasuk for that purpose, to say that there's a requirement of north when it comes to the Asham Mitzora. But the Gemara says to that, Imkain, if so, if that were the case, neima kra ki kachatos, who all the pasuk we need to say is that it is like the chatos. My kachatos ha'asham, why does it have to phrase it as the Asham is like the chatos? It's telling us keshar asham osiyah, that it's like all other Karban Ashams. And Rashi explains, Keshar Asham Osiyah, it's like other Karban Ashams, Hilkach, therefore, Le'inyan Safon Nami Ahadre, as far as the requirement of north, it's also considered like a regular Asham. V'chiksiv be'shchita b'tzafon, and therefore, when it does say that the slaughtering needs to be done in the north, again, by the Asham Mitzora, Dekra Le'ikuvas, it's coming to tell you that it is Le'ikuva, that it's a requirement. Ushar Asham Osnami, Minei Alfinan Le'ikuva, and we can learn other Karban Ashams from there as well, that it is required that they be slaughtered in the north. And the Gemara continues and asks, Lama li lakshuye lachatos, lama li lakshuye laola. Why is it that the Asham Mitzora needs to be compared both to the chatos and the ola in terms of where it's slaughtered? Rashi explains, Lama li lakshuye b'shchitaso lachatos uliola. Why are we comparing in terms of the slaughtering of this Asham Mitzora to both the chatos and the ola? T'chsib b'makom asher yishcheres hachatos v'yas ha'ola. It says that it's slaughtered in the place where the chatos and the ola are slaughtered. Why are we mentioning both of those karbanos? And the Gemara says to that, Amar Ravina, Ravina said, says itzrich, it is necessary. If it was compared to chatos and not compared to ola, hava amina, one might have thought chatos mehechon lamda. Where did we learn the requirement of north by chatos from? Me ola, that was learned from ola. And so then we would think davar halamid behekesh chozer malamid behekesh. Then we would think that something that's learned from a hekesh is able to teach with a hekesh, and that's not true. And so that's why we need to compare to the ola. But the Gemara continues and asks, Amarle Marzutra Breder Rav Mari Ravina. Marzutra, the son of Rav Mari, said to Ravina, V'nikshe la'ola. So why not just compare to the ola? V'lo nikshe la'chatas, and then we don't have to compare to the chatas. And the Gemara said to that, Hava Amina, one might have thought, Davar halamid behekesh, that's something that's learned from a hekesh, chozer u'malamid behekesh, that it can go ahead and teach through a hekesh. And Rashi explains, if we compare to Ola, but we didn't compare it to Chatos, then one might have thought Bialma, that in general, Davar halamid behekesh chozer malamid behekesh, that something that's learned from a hekesh can teach with a hekesh, and that's why we need to compare it to both, to specifically say that that is not the case. Something that's learned from a hekesh cannot teach through a hekesh. But the Gemara continues, now if you're going to say Nikshe akushe lachatos, that if it were true that Davar halamid behekesh can teach with a hekesh, then we would have just compared it to the Chata, so we would not have gotten mixed up if we compared to Ola to think that Davar halamid behekesh chozer malamid behekesh, because had that been true, we could have just compared it to the Chatas. But the Gemara says to that, you can't say that, because nichole demakesh leikar, because we would have just answered that it makes more sense to compare it to the main source, which is Ola, v'lo nakesh leilatafel, and not compare it to the tafel, to the derivative, which is Chatas. Lahachi akshe lachatos v'akshe laola, and that's the reason why we compare the Yashim to both the Chatas and the Ola, Lameimar, in order to teach, in order to say, Davar halamid behekesh, that's something that's learned from a hekesh, she'eino chozer malamid behekesh, that it's not able to teach through a hekesh. And the Gemara continues, Rava Amar, Rava says, and we'll take a look at the Shinuya Nuschos. It's Rava Amar, Davar halamish eino chozer malamid behekesh. The fact that something learned through a hekesh cannot go ahead and teach through a hekesh. Mehachad comes from here, it comes from the following. Again, Rava Amar Mehachad, Rava says it comes from here, from the following. Tichsib, because it's written, Ka'asher yuram mishor zevach hashlamim. And Rashi explains, Ka'asher yuram be'emurei parkoin Mashiach ksiv. This pasuk is written by the emurim, by the sacrificial portions of the power of the Kohen Gadol, that these are sacrificed. And Lamai Hilchasa, what's the purpose of writing this pasuk? Ili Oseres HaKavid Ushtei HaKlayos. If it's for the Oseres HaKavid, the diaphragm, and the Shtei HaKlayos, the two kidneys, that those are part of the sacrificial portions, Begufei Ksiv, that's already written in the pasuk. So why do we have to write it? And so the Gemara says, Misham Deboy Agmure, Yoseres HaKavid Ushtei HaKlayos, because we want to learn Yoseres HaKavid and Shtei Klayos, we want to teach Mipar Helam Davar Shel Tzibor, from the power of the communal sin, L'Seirei Avodas Kochavim, to the he-goat, by the communal sin of Avodah Zarah. And Begufei Lo Ksiv, it's not written Begufei, it's not written in the Parsha itself. Umipar Kohen Mashiach Hu de Gamar, and it would be learned from the power of the Kohen Gadol. And Lahachi Yitzrich Kasher Yuram, that's why we need Kasher Yuram, to Nehave Keman Dechasa Begufei, so that it's as if it is written in the context of the Parsha itself. V'lo Nehave Davar Halamid Behekesh Chozer Malamid Behekesh, that it won't be a situation of something learned through a hekesh that teaches through a hekesh. It's again from Kasher Yuram, essentially, that we learn Davar HaMalamed Behekesh is not able to be Malamed Behekesh. And Rashi explains, Mishum deboy agmura yoseres hakavid ushtei kloyos. Again, we want to teach by the diaphragm and the two kidneys. Shayatzarech lelamin mipar helim toras emurein l'seirei avodas kochavim. We learn from the par helim the idea of the sacrificial portions to the case of the seirei avodas kochavim. The iskish ahadadi leinyan haktaras emurin, because those two karbanos are compared to one another in terms of the sacrificial portions, the burning of those portions. Kedamrinon beperek Beis Shammai, like we said earlier in Perek Beis Shammai, Isha LaHashem v'chatosam al shegegosam. That was the comparison. And Rashi continues and says, Upar helim davar. Now, by par helim davar shel tzibor, begufe lo ksiv yoseres uklayos. It doesn't actually say the yoseres and the klayos by the par helim davar shel tzibor. And again, we're learning from the par helim davar shel tzibor to seirei avodas kochavim. Umipar koin Mashiach gomer behekesh. It's actually learned by par helim davar shel tzibor. It's learned from the power of the Kohen Gadol through a hekesh. hekesh. Kina amrin beperak beis Shammai, like we say in Perak beis Shammai, v'yasa lapar kasher asa lapar zepar kohen Mashiach. That reference over there in the pasuk is a reference to the par of the Kohen Gadol, and akshinu lahadadi. They're compared to one another. So even by par helam davar shel tzibor, it's learned through a hekesh. And lahachi itzrich kasher yuram. That's why we need the pasuk of kasher yuram. Again, kasher yuram is written by the par of the Kohen Gadol, bepar kohen Mashiach, by the par of the Kohen Gadol. And the idea is as follows: v'im eino inyan lo. If we don't need it by the par of the Kohen Gadol, it's already stated over there. So teneu le'inyan par helam. So then instead we apply it to par helam davar shel tzibor. In what sense? Then have a command dechsivi bepar helam gufe, that it should be as if it's written explicitly by par helam davar shel tzibor, that it's not simply learned from a hekesh to par helam davar shel tzibor. And that way, the lola have a davar halamid behekesh chozer malamed behekesh. That way we avoid the problem that it's something learned from a hekesh is teaching through a hekesh, which we're not able to learn in that fashion. Again, instead now it's as if it's actually written by par helam davar shel tzibor itself. And Rashi continues, Vikasha. Now, if you're going to ask, Hanafka lon hachdrasha mi v'asal apar ze par helam davar, don't we already have a drasha of v'asal apar telling us that that's talking about the par helam davar shel tzibor? Kina amram beperak beis Shammai, like we say in Perak beis Shammai. Rashi says, Hani mili, that drasha was latana devei Rabbi Shmuel. That drasha of v'asal apar was according to the Tana devei Rabbi Shmuel. Do Amar, because the Tana devei Rabbi Shmuel says lapar ze par helam, that the word lapar refers to the par helam davar shel tzibor. Avolatana devei Rav, but according to the Tana devei Rav, the Yomar v'asa lapar is the par Yom Kippurim, who says v'asa lapar is not talking about the par helim, it's talking about the par Yom Kippurim. So itzrich kasher yuram lahach drasha. That's why we need kasher yuram for this particular drasha. And the Gemara continues and asks, Amar le Rav Papa l'Rav, Rav Papa said to Rava, v'lichtave begufe v'lo nakish, but why not just write it explicitly by par helim, and not have the hekesh, not have the comparison to the par of the Kohen Gadol? Rashi explains, v'nichtave begufe de par helim behed, you just write explicitly the idea of the Yoseres and the Shtei Kloyos by the par helim, v'lo likshi lepar Kohen Mashiach, and don't do the comparison to the par of the Kohen Gadol. Hoel v'sof sof tarach v'chosav kasher yuram yeser lachi, since at the end of the day, we're having this extra part of the pasuk kasher yuram to make it as if we wrote it explicitly by the par helim. So why not just write it explicitly by the par helim? That's the question of Rav Papa. And the Gemara continues and answers, ikasa begufe, if it was written explicitly by par helim, velo akish, and there was not that comparison, so then havamina, then one might have thought that davar halamid behekesh, chozer malamid behekesh, that something learned through a hekesh could teach through a hekesh. V'chiteim, and if you're going to say nikshe akushe, why not then just have a hekesh? Why write it explicitly? We could have answered that. We would say nichale de kasve begufe. It was more appropriate to the Torah to write it explicitly. Mida akish le akushe, from doing a hekesh, it makes more sense to just write it explicitly. Lahachi kasve viakshe, and that's the reason why it's written and we do the hekesh. Lameimra means to teach us davar halamid behekesh ein chozer malamed behekesh. We specifically want to teach this rule that something that's learned through a hekesh cannot teach through a hekesh. That's why again we do the comparison, but then also have the extra phrase in the pasuk. Again, that extra phrase in the pasuk of kasher yuram to make it as if it was taught explicitly in the pasuk to teach that davar halamid behekesh ein chozer malamed behekesh. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, davar halamid behekesh ein chozer malamed behekesh. Again, we said above, something that is learned through a hekesh cannot go ahead and teach through a hekesh. And imi de Rava, imi de Ravina, whatever the source is, whether it's Rava above, whether it's Ravina above. But the question is as follows: davar halamid behekesh mao sheyilmed begzeira shava. What if something is learned from a hekesh? Can it then teach through a gzeira shava? And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here a proof from the following brisa. Rabbi Nosson ben Avtulmis Omer, Rabbi Nosson ben Avtulmis says, Minayin lepricha bebegadim shi tahora. From where do we know that if the tzaras totally spreads entirely by begadim, by garments, that is a sign of purity? Nemar, because it says karachas vegabachas bebegadim. It says the phrase karachas and gabachas by begadim. V'nemar karachas vegabachas be'adam. And it says the same phrase by a person, by tzaras of a person. Malahalan parach bekul bekulo tar, just like over there, if it spreads entirely, we say pure. Afkan soto over here by begadim, parach bekulo tar. If it spreads entirely, we say tar, we say it's pure. Now that is a situation of a gezerah shaveh. And v'hasa manola, now over there, from where do we learn it? Meaning the karachas v'gabachas by Adam, where is that learned from? Dichsiv mei rosho v'yad raglav. That's because it says from his head until his feet. It's a comparison, it's a hekesh. V'iskish rosho l'raglav, we have a comparison between the tzaras of his head and the tzaras by his feet, by his body. Ma'lahalan kulo hafach lavon parach bekulo tar. Just like over there, if he's entirely white, it spreads entirely, we say pure. Afkan, so to over here by rosho, kulo hafach lavon parach bekulo tar. If it entirely spreads, we say pure. And so there you have a hekesh. So you have a situation of something learned through a hekesh that then teaches through a gezerah shaveh. That proves that we are able to teach a gezerah shaveh from something that is learned through a hekesh. But the Gemara continues. Amar Rabbi Yochanan says this is not a proof at all, because b'chol Torah kula lemeid and lamed milamed. In all of the Torah, you can learn one thing that's derived from something that is derived. We were never asking whether this works b'chol Torah kula. This was a question only by kodshim. Chutz min hakodshim, with the exception of kodshim, she'ein donin lamed milamed. That's where you cannot learn something derived from something that is derived. And so therefore, you really do not have a proof from tzaras to our question about kodshim. And Rabbi Yochanan continues, Dimkain, because otherwise, lo yomar tzafona ba'asham, if it was true that by kodshim you can learn something derived from something derived, you wouldn't need to say the requirement of slaughtering in the north by a carbon asham. V'teisi b'gzeira shaveh, and you could learn through a gzeira shaveh, because again, if you're going to say that a gzeira shaveh can be used from something which was learned through a hekesh, we have a gzeira shaveh here. The kodshe kodshem mechatos. You have a gzeira shaveh that it says kodshe kodshem, it says by asham, and it says kodshe kodshem by chatos, and you would just make a gzeira shaveh because chatos is learned from a hekesh, and then use the gzeira shaveh to asham. And so lav lememer, doesn't that mean to teach the davar halamed behekesh ein chozer malamed begzeira shaveh? Doesn't that show that something learned from a hekesh is not able to teach through a gzeira shaveh? It shows that by kodshim we don't say that a gzeira shaveh is able to be used from something which is learned through a hekesh. That's what Rabbi Yochanan's proof is. But the Gemara says, who says that's a proof? V'dilma, maybe the real reason the gzeira shaveh from chatas doesn't work is mishum di'iko lemifrach, because you can refute the gzeira shaveh. You can say malach chatas shekein mechaperes al chayve krisos. Chatas is unique because it atones for chayve krisos. So maybe really the gzeira shaveh could, in theory, be learned by kodshim, even from something which was learned from a hekesh. But over here, the gzeira shaveh simply doesn't work because chatas is unique. But the Gemara says to that, it's not true. You can't refute the gzeira shaveh in that way because kodshe kodshim yisei riksivi. There are many times that it says kodshe kodshim. The point over here is, as Rashi says, kodshe kodshim yisei riksivi behu v'havale gzeira shaveh mufna mishnei tzdadim. It's a gzeira shaveh with free words, extra words on both sides of the gzeira shaveh. These are extra words. Ve'ein meshivin oleh. And the rule is you can't refute a gzeira shaveh if you have a gzeira shaveh that's mufna mishnei tzdadim, that you're using freed up words, so to speak, on both sides of the gzeira shaveh. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Davar halamin mehekesh chozer malamed bekal v'chomer. What about something that is learned from a hekesh? Can it teach through a kal v'chomer? And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Amud Aleph.